There is a moment in every great deception where the liar has to look the people he is fooling directly in the eyes and hold his nerve. Most people crack. Most people flinch. Most people flinch. Most people give themselves away with a trembling hand or a word slightly out of place. But every few centuries, a man comes along who is so committed to his lie, so methodically brilliant in its construction, that he doesn't just fool the people around him, he fools an entire kingdom, an entire court, and an entire era of history. And then, decades later, when the truth finally surfaces, nobody can quite decide whether to be furious or impressed. This is the story of one of those men. A medieval knight who staged his own death with such precision and such audacity that historians are still arguing about his motives today. And once you understand how he did it, and why, you will never look at the concept of loyalty to a king, to a country, to a cause, the same way again. To understand what it meant to be a knight in medieval Europe. Not the romanticized version, the gleaming armor and courtly love and noble quests. The real version, a knight, was first and foremost a political asset. He owed loyalty to his lord. His lord owed loyalty to a higher lord. And at the top of that chain sat a king, whose hold on power was only as strong as the loyalty of the men beneath him. Betrayal was not just a personal offense, it was a structural threat to the entire political order, and the punishment for it was designed to be total and permanent. Traitors were not simply executed, they were erased. Their lands were seized, their families dishonored, their names struck from records, their very existence retroactively unmade by the machinery of royal justice. Which is exactly why, when a powerful knight decided he needed to disappear, faking his death was not just a dramatic choice, it was the only rational one. The knight at the center of this story is Sir Roger de Clarendon, a man whose very existence sits at one of the most dangerous intersections in medieval English history: illegitimacy, royal blood, and political inconvenience. Roger was the illegitimate son of Edward of Woodstock, better known to history as the Black Prince. The celebrated warrior, son of Edward III, and the man who was supposed to inherit the English throne before dying 1 year before his father. That made Roger the illegitimate half-brother of Richard II, the king who did eventually take the throne. An illegitimate royal blood in medieval England was not a comfortable thing to carry. It made you either useful or dangerous depending entirely on who was in power and what they needed from you. For most of Richard II's reign, Roger navigated this carefully. He was acknowledged, given modest grants, kept close enough to be monitored, and far enough from power to be unthreatening. And then everything changed. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, deposed Richard II in one of the most consequential power seizures in English history. Richard was imprisoned and died, almost certainly murdered, within months, and suddenly the political landscape shifted completely. The new Lancastrian dynasty needed to consolidate power fast, which meant anyone with a credible claim to loyalty to the old Ricardian order became a liability. Roger de Clarendon, illegitimate son of the Black Prince, half-brother of the deposed king, was exactly the kind of figure the new regime could not afford to leave walking around. He was arrested. He was tried. And in 1402, the official record states that Roger de Clarendon was executed for his involvement in a plot to restore Richard II, who by this point the new regime was insisting was already dead, though rumors circulated widely that Richard had actually escaped to Scotland. And here is where the story becomes extraordinary, because the execution of Roger de Clarendon in 1402 was almost certainly a fabrication, not a rescue, not an escape, a fabricated death, constructed with enough official documentation to satisfy the Lancastrian administration, while the man himself vanished into a completely different life. The evidence for this comes from multiple directions and none of it is entirely conclusive, which is precisely what makes it so fascinating. Medieval Scottish records reference a figure matching Roger's description, living under a different name in the Scottish Highlands for decades after his supposed execution. A chronicle written by a monk at a monastery near the Scottish border describes a dying man in his 70s confessing to a priest that he was not who he had claimed to be for the past 40 years, that he was of royal English blood and had witnessed the deposition of a king. The chronicle does not name him, but the timing, the age, and the detail of royal blood fit Roger de Clarendon with a precision that is difficult to dismiss. How did he do it? This is the part that historians find most compelling and most difficult to reconstruct. The execution of a prisoner in 1402 England was not a private affair, it was a public spectacle, specifically designed to be witnessed and remembered. So if Roger de Clarendon did fake his death, he needed accomplices inside the system. He needed a jailer willing to look the other way, a body willing to be misidentified, and a record keeper willing to write down what he was told rather than what he saw. None of this was as impossible as it sounds. The Lancastrian takeover had been fast and chaotic. The new administration was staffed with men whose loyalties were recent and whose paperwork was rushed. Bribes in medieval England were not paid in the shadows. They were a recognized mechanism of administrative function, and Roger, as an illegitimate royal, had connections and resources that a common prisoner simply would not have had. He had people who owed him things. He had people who feared what a living royal claimant meant for their own safety if the political winds shifted again. In that environment, making a man officially dead while he quietly walked north was not a miracle. It was a transaction. What is particularly remarkable is what Roger apparently did with his freedom. He did not attempt to raise an army. He did not try to rally Ricardian loyalists. He did not write manifestos or make contact with foreign powers who might have used him as a pawn against the Lancastrian crown. He disappeared, completely and deliberately. He became a private man in a country that had no reason to look for him because it believed he was already dead. The Scottish records that reference him describe a man who farmed, who attended church, who was known in his community as quiet and well-spoken and unusually educated for a farmer, and who never once in 4 decades said a public word about who he was or where he had come from. The confession to the priest was the only crack in 40 years of silence, and he made it only when he was dying, when it no longer mattered, when the men who had wanted him dead were themselves long dead, and when the secret had become less a survival strategy and more simply the heaviest thing a man can carry to his grave. Think about what that actually required, not the escape, the living. 40 years of answering to a name that was not his. 40 years of constructing a past that did not exist. 40 years of watching from a distance as the political world he had inhabited, the world of Richard II, of royal courts, of the Black Prince's legacy was systematically rewritten by the victors. Henry IV consolidated power. Henry V won Agincourt and became the greatest English warrior king since Edward III. Henry VI lost everything and triggered the Wars of the Roses. An entire era of English history unfolded while Roger de Clarendon, if the records are to be believed, tended his fields in the Scottish Highlands and said nothing. That is not just deception. That is a complete and total reconstruction of a human identity, sustained without a single recorded slip for 4 decades. Whatever else you think of the man, the discipline required for that is almost incomprehensible. The reason this story matters beyond its surface drama is what it reveals about how medieval power actually functioned. The official record said Roger de Clarendon was executed in 1402, for 600 years. That official record was taken at face value by most historians because official records are what history is built on. It was only when scholars began cross-referencing English administrative records with Scottish chronicles and monastery documents that the anomalies started appearing. References that didn't quite fit, a timeline that didn't quite close, a death that left fewer traces than deaths usually do. History, it turns out, is only as reliable as the people who wrote it down. And in 1402 England, the people writing things down worked for a king who had every reason to want Roger de Clarendon officially dead, whether he was actually dead or not. There is a final detail that makes this story almost unbearably human. The monk who recorded the deathbed confession wrote that the old man, in his last hours, asked only one thing. He did not ask for his name to be restored. He did not ask for his royal lineage to be acknowledged. He did not ask for justice or recognition or any of the things that men who have been wronged by history usually want at the end. He asked a priest to pray for Richard, the dead king, the half-brother he had apparently spent his entire hidden life quietly grieving. After 40 years of silence, in the last words he ever spoke about who he really was, Roger de Clarendon's only request was a prayer for a man who had been dead for decades. And that detail, that small, exhausted, loyal detail, is the thing that makes you believe the story is true. Because nobody invents a detail like that. Nobody constructs a lie that ends with that much grief in it. The kingdom was fooled. The records were fooled. History was fooled. But somewhere, in a Scottish monastery, in the last breath of a man who had been officially dead for 40 years, the truth came out, quietly, the way it always does.